Okay, welcome to my nightmare. This is the green screen shot you wish you didn't have to deal with. I've already got it loaded up in Blender because I didn't want to waste a lot of time. I'm assuming if you're watching this video, you probably have a basic understanding of dealing with nodes and compositing in Blender, and you're looking for a little bit deeper information about practical problem solving as opposed to which button do I click, to pop a node up on the screen. So if you're a total newbie, there's plenty of stuff online that'll give you, bring you up to speed on how to use the Blender interface. But long story short is I have here obviously a compositing node window. It's obnoxiously small. That's because I didn't want to break Camtasia and the interactivity of my, obviously when I move around, I want things to actually move and not have to wait 3 or 4 minutes for the screen to catch up. So anyway, here you got your node window. Here you got a UV image editor window, and you probably know that the thing to do here is select viewer nodes so that whatever viewer nodes you have up here on your screen, you will see the results here. Now, for your enrichment, I have already done a RAM preview that obviously got boogered up somehow. So I'm going to do a RAM preview now. Well, that's what happens when you start shooting a training video and make a mistake and have to stop and rewind and everything else. You're bound to forget a few things along the way. So anyway, a couple minutes ago I did have a RAM preview, but then as I began to look at all the myriad difficulties with this shot, I quite frankly got the giggles and had to stop the camera. So hopefully that won't happen again. But here we have a lot of issues. Let's go through them one by one. Issue number one, let's talk about spill. If you look close at our subject, look at all this green spill on her. This is actually the issue that led the client to contact me. The client is an After Effects user trying to use After Effects keyer to do this shot and was finding that he just was having trouble getting the shot to his satisfaction using the tools that are built into After Effects. He was looking at Blender as an alternative tool that might help him to solve this problem. He found my online tutorial called The Ultimate Keyer and contacted me, and I said, hey, let's look at the problems of this shot together and solve them. And after we solve them, who knows, maybe we can have an excuse to create a training video. So here we are. Problem number one, obviously, is spill. We've got to get rid of all this green spill. And problem number two is look at all the tracking markers. The tracking markers are passing in front of and behind our talent. Not in front of, but behind our talent, so that the tracking markers are crossing over the border area. Obviously, this is a perfect example of that. The tracking markers are not green, so we're gonna have to find another way to extract them from our video without resorting to rotoscoping. I mean, you could garbage mat. You could put a little garbage mat here and animate that, and it'd take you a couple days of dinking around just to be able to deal with the tracking markers. So we got spill issues, we got tracking marker issues, and by the way, we've got tracking issues. Okay, I mean, let's watch the whole clip. Look at what's going on here. Whoops, sorry, little mistake. Okay, see what's happening here, friends? The camera is zooming and panning, and last time I checked, Blender does not have a way to do tracking. Now, yeah, we could go download Voodoo and do a 3D track and hope against hope that it does a good job of following these trackers and setting up a 3D scene in Blender so we can do a 3D track. I'm kind of hoping maybe there's a better way. I think I found one. And when you look at my solution for doing a 2D track in Blender, you might find that it's useful for actually a lot of situations you're going to run into when you really don't want the hassle and overhead and mathematical misery of dealing with 3D tracking. Another problem, I mean, in my opinion, not a huge problem actually, is the fact that you've got a lot of variance in the green screen. I mean, there's you know, you can see what's going on here. There's a lot of lighter and dark areas. So, well, how are we going to tackle this shot? I basically want to take a number of steps. Step number one is going to be to garbage mat it. Garbage mat means I want to find a way to isolate maybe just the head, maybe isolate just the body, and eliminate all of this background from my shot. I want to do this quickly. I want to have a fast way to at least rough in my subject. Okay, the tried and true way to do that is called garbage matting, and we're going to look at that first. Our next problem solving technique is going to be to get rid of the green spill on the subject. I will tell you that there are a number of algorithms for removing green spill, and the solution I came up with for this particular shot is kind of unusual. So if you're looking for the textbook cookie cutter spill removal technique, you're not going to find it in this particular training video, because the solution in this case was faster and easier using a kind of a non-intuitive technique that might surprise you, but we'll get to that later. Step 3 obviously is going to be to pull a key where we get nice, a nice tight mat around our subject. Did I say tracking? No, I said garbage matting, spill removal, pulling a mat, tracking. We've got to do a 2D track on this subject. And then we got to put it all together and do things. Well, look at right here. Let's see, I got to find my spot. But you can see there's a lot of motion blur on this subject. So that's another thing we need to make sure that we have a solution for is how do we match our background's motion blur to the subject. And Blender's vector blur is a really good way to do that. So that's the end of the introduction, and let's move on to the next step, which is going to be garbage matting. Had a choice I had to make on this particular video. Do I want to completely recreate the entire production process from scratch, or do I want to start with preset scenes, take the risk that maybe I'll forget to explain something that I did? I've chosen the latter approach, so send me an email if there's something I left out. Garbage matting is a pretty simple, pretty fast process. The idea being that in my 3D window, I'm going to load up a background image of my subject. Now in this case, what I did was I set my render settings to NTSC, DV. All these images in the image sequence were all 720 by 480, which by the way is kind of a drag. I mean, for pulling a green screen, you really want HD footage if you can get it. So as far as the footage goes, we almost kind of have a worst case scenario, but step 1 is a background image. We want to, in the view here, we want to load the background image panel, which obviously I already did, so I'll just do it again for you so you can see that I really did do it. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to load an image sequence, and when I click this little thing here, it lets me go ahead and browse to the shot. I loaded the shot up. I turn on auto refresh. That means that when I go forward in my frames, it's going to go ahead and obviously play the video. Total number of frames is 142. So that's step 1, load your background image. The next step was I added a mesh plane to my scene. Okay, just like this one. This plane is going to be my garbage mat. The way that's going to work is I'm going to go to my materials, and I'm going to add a new material, which I've already created here, and it's just a pure solid white. Why do I want solid white? Well, my background's going to be black. My world is going to be black. My plane is going to be white. That means this is going to be a pure black and white matte. So the trick is going to be to cover up the parts of the subject that we want to cover up with the plane so that they're effectively masked out. Hope that made sense. I'm going to delete this because I already popped a plane up. Now, this is the important thing that you want to get out of here. I went up to my preferences up here, and in my auto keyframe section or option here, I clicked action and object. I can't remember offhand if I clicked available or needed, but I think I did needed, so that it would only insert keyframes for what I did, in the sense that, okay, for example, if I use my grabber to move the plane in the x-axis, for example, I don't really want Blender to insert a keyframe in the y and the z-axis. I only want it in the axis I'm using. So what do we do? If we go to a shaded view, obviously our plane is pure white. If we render this frame, you know what I need to do here for you? So I need to change this so that when we render, we don't render into a window, we render into an image editor. Hopefully this will work. Yes. Okay, that way when it renders, it's going to render in the screen so you can see what I did. But basically, if I render that, you can see what's going on. The plane is white, the background's black. Okay. What we're going to do for a garbage matte is we're going to go to the first frame, and we're going to size the plane over our subject. Okay? Then what I do is I just go 10 frames forward and adjust. Okay? You make these adjustments, and you can see down here in this window, you can see the keyframes that are being inserted. All I wanted to do was matte out the just the head. I don't care about the body at this point. If I move this, presumably, yeah, you can see right down here it inserted just on this axis, on the axis I moved it on, it inserted a keyframe there. It just inserted another one. And that's what you want. You want Blender to, you want to do this fast. So, all right, so now I'm going to go to here, make a little adjustment. And then basically what you do is you keep splitting the difference. So if I go back to the beginning and I put in a keyframe every 10 frames, and then I find that maybe on the 5th frame it was off a little bit, well, then you split the difference between the, you know, your 2 keyframes, and you make an adjustment. And hopefully that will, you know, the net result will be that the plane will follow your subject closely enough to where you won't have to insert a keyframe at every, you know, every frame, which obviously you want to avoid. Okay, in this case, the only place where I had to really put in a lot of keyframes was right here towards the end, because there's a pretty rapid motion. And in fact, see right there it's off a little bit. So I'm going to go ahead and move that to there. And then you can see that it follows her pretty well. Okay, that was the head garbage matte. Okay, and when I rendered that, I rendered it full size, okay, and I rendered it as a JPEG image sequence. So that gave me, I called it GB_head, which obviously that means garbage matte head. So now I have this image sequence that represents the isolation of just the head area. Okay, step 2, garbage matte body. All right, in this case, we once again want to load up our background image. There it is. And in this case, I did the same thing again. I went ahead and animated this. This is an image sequence, 142 image, auto refresh. Okay, I think we're good. So this time I'm not going to go through all the steps and show you how I did it. I used the same material, obviously, which is a shadeless, it's shadeless white, so that when it renders, it's just going to be as bright can be, right? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and render this into the image editor again so you can see what it looks like. There's the render. Let's play it. Okay, so you can see what's going on. And I'm going to say, to garbage matte the head, probably took 5 minutes. To garbage matte the body, probably took 5 minutes. Not a big deal. Now in this case, just so you know, I'm going to tell you right now, I knew that for pulling a green screen key, that this area, there's a few points in the shot where the subject's hair In fact, if I turn the blend down, you can see how bright this is. You know, and the whole point of a color difference key is to get the difference between the white and the green and the red channels. And if you have a highlight that's blown out, then the difference between the red and the green channel is going to be 0 because they're both at maximum. So this area is going to be a problem. Bottom line is when I pull a matte, it's going to be a problem. So garbage matte markers. Let's look at what I did here. Yes. Okay. The purpose of this garbage matte was to isolate the head and get that highlight region without being able to have the markers in the shot. So I needed to keep the markers out of the shot. Okay, so that was another garbage matte that I knew I might need it. You know, it took 2 minutes to create that. So you'll see later where that became useful. But anyway, that's garbage matting. Let's just stop here and go to the next step, which is going to be spill removal. We'll come back and see later in the final composite where the garbage matting comes in useful. Okay, spill removal. One of the bugs in Blender is that you have to, sometimes when you save a project, you have to reload the footage. When you reload the project, reload the footage into the nodes. So you kind of have to wake it back up by reconnecting the viewer nodes. Okay, now there's a lot of ways to reduce spill, and in this case the result we were after was something like this, where we've gotten rid of the green cast. Both, you know, getting rid of it in the background is really not that important. The idea is to get rid of it in the subject. How do we do that? Without really changing the color, you know, of their skin or whatever. You can check how well you're doing on your spill removal by zooming in so that you can't see your background, and then switching between viewer nodes. And you can see that the skin color looks really good, actually. And the spill's been very effectively removed. I'm kind of curious how that's affected her hair color. It looks like the only real change is, obviously everything's shifted towards the red a little bit, but on the other hand, you can see green sort of corrupting this whole thing anyway. And I'm thinking in my color curves here, if I take just a little bit out of the blue channel, which is going to yellow it a bit, that might actually offset that slight reddish shift. You know, if you take out a lot of blue, everything moves towards the yellow end of the spectrum. So how did we do this? Well, as I told you in the introduction, kind of an unintuitive way to accomplish it in this particular case. What I did was I put out, ignore this blur node. Theoretically, we don't know that that's there. In fact, let me unhook that and plug the output image in right here. What I did was I just popped up a bunch of viewer nodes so I could look at I'm going to unhook all these so I can rehook them up and kind of wake them up so I can see them again. But I took the red channel, put it in a viewer node, green channel into a viewer node, blue channel. Here's what struck me as I looked through these. What struck me was this. As I looked at the green channel and the blue channel, I noticed that for this particular shot, there's not a lot of difference between them. I mean, I looked at the only real difference is the blue channel is a little darker and the green channel is a little softer. That's normal because the blue channel is usually where all the garbage in a shot or in a photograph is usually found in the blue channel. The red channel and the green channel typically going to be a little softer and smoother. The blue channel is going to be more grainy and ugly and messy. But when I zoom out here, I can see in the background there's a huge difference. So, that made me think. For this particular shot, my blue channel and green channel are very, very similar, except for the fact that their backgrounds are very different. And the background in the blue channel is obviously much darker. Well, that means that if I were to take my original image and simply take the green channel of it out and replace it with the blue channel so that I have the blue channel feeding into a new green channel. So in other words, the green channel for my video is replaced with its original blue channel. Okay? Theoretically, because the background in the blue channel is so much darker, my thought was that that's going to suppress a lot of that green, because the green, all this green and spill is coming from the fact that the green channel is really bright. Blue channel is a little darker. So that was my theory. Tested my theory like this. First thing I did was I blurred my image a little bit. And to tell you the truth, right now, as I'm going through this, I don't remember why I blurred the entire image. Actually, I might be remembering wrong here. I think this is a node that I never actually used, because you can see the size on the blur is 0. So I think we can effectively eliminate this node. What I was going to tell you is what I did was I blurred the blue channel. So I took a node out of the blue channel and I put it into, and I did a Gaussian blur of two pixels in the X and only 1 in the Y. Okay. And I'll show you why I did that. Let me pop up another viewer node here. 2 viewer nodes. And let's just compare the original blue channel to the blurred blue channel. Not a big difference, but you can see it's blurred a little bit. And what I thought was interesting about that was that the blurred blue channel more closely resembled the original green channel. Okay? Except for the fact the blue channel is a little bit darker. A little bit darker in the subject, lot darker in the background. And presumably a lot darker in any areas that happen to have a lot of green. If you can get rid of the green, you get rid of the spill. So I took the blue channel and I blurred it. Okay? But instead of simply replacing the blue channel with the green channel, other way around, instead of replacing the green channel with the blue, what I did was I added them together. So what I wanted to do is I wanted to mix back in a little bit of the original green channel. So I take my blurred blue channel and I go out of that into a math, or into a color node in add mode. And I take the original green channel here, but the factor is only 0.1. So most of what's going to feed back into a new green channel is going to be the blurred blue channel, but a little bit of the original green channel. Okay, so understand, I break the image up into its RGB alpha, and over here with this node, I'm recombining it. I'm recombining the RGB. Alpha doesn't come into play here, but so essentially what I've done is, with this signal flow right here, all I've done is modified the green channel, replacing it with actually the original blue channel modified a little bit with a blur and with the original green channel. And then just for taste, I actually did a little bit of a color correction on the despilled footage. Now you're probably going to want to see what the despilled footage looks like. So this is the footage after it's been modified. Now compare original footage, modified footage. This technique isn't necessarily going to work in every case. I did a slight color correction to yellow it back out a little bit. And then this is what I rendered in my composite. So now I've got despilled footage for pulling my matte. Obviously for the actual matte is going to be pulled from this footage because we need all the green values in order to pull our matte. But what we're going to actually be masking out with the matte is going to be this despilled footage. So on to the next topic, which is going to be pulling the matte. Okay, friends, this is where it gets hairy. Pulling the mat on this shot was going to be tricky. There were a couple compromises that had to come into play. One is, if you've watched my online tutorial called The Ultimate Keyer, there's some pretty deep mathematical stuff you can do with color channels in order to pull a really amazing key. In this case, this footage is it's standard definition. That means that no matter what I do, kind of ignore what I'm doing here. I'm just getting the footage back up here on the screen for you to look at. No matter what I do, I'm going to wind up having some blurred edges, soft edges. Let's say quality-wise, this is a corporate video kind of thing. We're probably going after a quality level that's going to be similar to a good TV weatherman, like what you might see on the Weather Channel, not necessarily feature film quality edges. Okay, so let's just accept the fact that that's our standard. Realistically, it has to be, because our original footage is NTSC resolution to begin with, which is always going to be a little challenging for pulling a really good green screen. So what I'm looking at is another fact actually that's relevant to that particular point, is that this is a tracked shot. That means the camera's in motion. There's motion blur all the time. That means that people are not going to be able to see the edges that closely. Okay? What's happening here on this edge is just not going to be seen very well because the camera's moving. Okay? Everything's blurred anyway. So that means we've got some latitude. So let's look at what we did here step by step. The first step was, let's pull a rough key. Okay? And we're going to use just the tried and true color difference key technique. Okay? So that means, let me pop another viewer up here. Let's look at the red channel. We're going to take the red channel. From the red channel, we're going to subtract, we're going to subtract the red channel from the green channel. That's going to give us this. Right. By the way the noodles always jump, if you plug something else into the image here in the viewer node, the noodles jump around, jump down to the alpha. I don't know why. I don't know where that behavior is desirable, but apparently the ton and the guys who are programming Blender think that that's a desirable behavior because it always does it, and you're always having to pop stuff out of the alpha channel. But anyway, there's your rough red minus green color difference key. Now I put it through a color ramp and increased the contrast. And I also, of course, I reversed. Obviously, when we pull a matte, whatever's white is going to be seen and whatever's black is going to be matted out. So we have to take our rough color difference key and reverse the white and the black. And we use a color ramp to do that by taking the little adjusters that go from black to white and just reversing them so they go from white to black. And then moving them closer together obviously increases the contrast. Okay, now, you're no dummy. You can see the problem, which is that we can see all of our tracking markers. Getting rid of the tracking markers is one of the biggest challenges of this shot. It's not that big of a deal if you know how to do it, but that's going to be our next step. Okay. The first step in getting rid of some of that problem is to use the garbage mats we created earlier. Okay? So now let me create another viewer node. Pop it down here so you can see the output from the first garbage mat we rendered. Let me just jump forward, and you can see that it moves around because this is the plane that we simply animated to follow the girl's head, and it garbage mats it out. So if we take this garbage mat and we multiply it by our basic color difference key, then that gives us this. So that's a step in the right direction, because now we've isolated the head, we've gotten rid of a lot of tracking markers, but we still have the problem. If I move around here, we might be able to see a little better. We still have the problem that some of the tracking markers are passing behind our talent and so becoming visible. I've got a pretty innovative way to solve that problem that once you understand it, I'm sure you'll probably use it a lot. But let's go back here. This is our other garbage mat isolating her body. I feed that garbage matte into another multiply node, and once again, multiply that by the original color difference key. That gives us this. So now we've isolated the body. Now granted, when we did the garbage mats, we could have created a plane, or we could have created a polygon with a lot of points so that we actually animated the garbage mat very closely around our subject. You know, if we'd have done that and animated it with shape keys, that might have, made the process a little easier, but I don't think so, because the problem is that if we're not going to try to rotoscope it and literally get a good edge with the rotoscope, then no matter what we do, we still are going to have these tracking markers. We're still going to have to get rid of them. So there really was no point in doing a laborious garbage matting process that amounted to a rotoscope. It made more sense to do it really fast using just these boxes and then have another technique to get rid of the tracking markers. Okay, now if we take these two garbage matted, color difference keys modified by the garbage mat, and we add them together with a math node, we just add them, okay, we get, obviously, the sumupence of the two, which is this. Okay, we still have to deal with our tracking markers, but at least we've gotten rid of all the tracking markers that are out here. So the garbage mats have served their purpose to at least isolate the border area around our subject. I fed this into a blur node because, like I told you earlier, this is NTSC resolution. We're going to have to blur the mat and choke it no matter what we do. And the camera's in motion, so no big deal. If we got a little bit blurry mat, that's cool. Okay? So I blur the mat. Now, that's as far as we can go. Now we've got to try to find a little more innovative technique to get rid of these tracking markers. What are we going to do? Well, here's the way I did it. All right? Ignore me for a minute. Okay, I loaded up another image sequence of my color spilled footage because I wanted to just study my footage. I wanted to study my color channels, find out what's going on. And as I looked at my color channels, this is what I discovered. I saw that in my despilled footage, the red channel shows my tracking markers really, really, really bright, and everything else isn't. I mean, by comparison, everything else is not that bright, except this problem right here, the highlight on her hair. So if I just use contrast to isolate the tracking markers, I'm still going to have the hair problem. Well, no, I'm not. And the reason I'm not is because, as you'll recall, earlier, I created a garbage mat of just the top part of her head, being careful to leave the tracking markers out, making sure the plane did not cover the tracking markers. So, if I take this and multiply it by this channel and add some contrast, then what I get is this. What I've done is I've used a garbage mat and a very high contrast color channel to isolate just the tracking markers. And obviously we're using a color ramp to increase the contrast and make that as effective as possible, okay? So without our contrast increase, this is what we get when we multiply them together. So then we just kick the contrast up until we've basically made everything black except the tracking markers. Making sense? Now I knew that if I combined this, okay, with the this to subtract out the tracking markers, because this was already blurred, I knew this was not going to be sufficient. So try to stay with me here as I explain this. What I did was I took this and I stuck it through a dilate erode node and I dilated it a little bit, okay? Result being, let me just show you in a viewer node here what happened. Okay, basically all my tracking markers got a little fatter, okay? Then I went a little farther. I blurred them a little bit, okay? Okay. So now I've got all my tracking markers isolated and blurred. Now I'm going to take this and I'm going to subtract it from my original color difference key that's been garbage matted, okay? So I've got this. I want to subtract this. And here's my subtract node. And the result is this, which looks pretty darn good. As it happens, I found that I wanted to, I don't know where that node just went. I wanted to increase the contrast a little bit more. You can hardly see it, but, well, obviously you can't see it actually because, here, let me do this. Pop that out, pop this in. Okay, this is before the color ramp, this is after. So you can see what I did. I just tightened up the contrast a little bit with this node in order to sharpen up the edges and clamp them in a little bit. So that's known as choking a matte. You're taking the edges of the matte and you're causing them to suck in tighter to the subject. Okay? This is what I fed into a set alpha node, and setting the alpha of obviously this, which is my color spilled footage. You want to use your original footage. You don't want to use this. You don't want to take the nice matte that you created and put it on your original footage. You want to put it on the color spilled footage. And then the net result, setting that alpha, is this. Wow. You can even see right here how combining that special matte that got rid of the tracking markers, you can see what it did. It actually got rid of that tracking marker right on the edge, so everything looks clean. Pretty amazing. Okay, so there's a look at our final footage, and what I did was I rendered that out as a, I used Targa. I rendered this out as a Targa image sequence so that the alpha channel was actually embedded in the images. I knew this was a good enough matte, and I knew I'd gotten rid of the tracking markers, so I went ahead and cooked the alpha channel right into it. I could have, if I had wanted to, I could have also, obviously I could have rendered this matte separately and combined it with the images in another step. But as it was, like I said, I was comfortable enough with this matte that I felt it was okay to just go ahead and bake the alpha channel right into it. So I rendered that out as Targas. And of course, obviously, if you're using Targas, you don't have to use the alpha channel that's in the Targa. So if I needed to redo the matte later, I could have without having to re-render the images. So now, on to the next step, which is going to be tracking. Okay, tracking. This is... well, I hope that you find this solution as effective as I did. I thought it made a lot of sense and really was amazing how good the results were, and very, very quickly. So I'm just going to kind of go through step by step and explain to you how I went from motion tracking to actually doing the final composite. So this is we're in the home stretch here, folks. Here's what I did. I loaded the original green screen footage into Blender as a background image in the 3D window. Okay? And let's see here. As I scroll through it, there it is. Here's what I did. I was actually glad that the client had these tracking markers that were very bold, sort of obnoxious tracking markers, but the thing that was good about them was that they had some thickness. And the reason that was important is if you want to do a 2D track, I'm going to give you a little theory here. The basic concept of 2D tracking is that if we can follow the motion of the trackers, not only as a two-dimensional point in space, but if we also can follow the size of the markers, then we have all the information we need to match move the shot. In other words, so, I mean, you can see what I did here. I created a polygon that was the shape of the marker, right? And then what I did was I went every 10 frames and I moved the marker so it pretty much matched. I moved my polygon so it pretty much matched the marker. It doesn't have to be perfectly perfect, because if you zoom in like this, for all intents and purposes, you're getting the same sub-pixel resolution that the tracker that's built into Fusion or After Effects has. You know, so if you're close, you're probably going to be fine. So what I did was I just set it up so that every 10 frames I would move the marker So it basically stayed with the marker in the video footage. And I also scaled it. Okay, let me make sure I'm on my same frame here. Okay, now what you don't want to do, this is the real important thing I want you to remember, is don't ever use the manipulator here to scale your marker. It's totally critical that you only use the S key like this, so that when you scale the polygon, you're scaling it in the X and the Y the same. If I were to use this manipulator to, I just hit undo and boogered something up, but if I use my manipulator to scale it, I'm going to be scaling it in either the X or the Y, and the resulting translation of my background image will wind up being squashed vertically or horizontally instead of being scaled in both the X and the Y, which makes it appear that the camera is zooming in or out. If that doesn't make sense right now, just stay with me a little bit longer and it will make sense. The first step is to create a polygon that's the approximate shape of your tracker, and then every 10 frames, go ahead and follow that tracker by both moving and scaling your polygon. Now, it may have, it might have been necessary to maybe track this one as well. But as it turned out, just tracking one, because by going every 10 frames, like from here to here, okay, I lost it there for a second, but it came back in pretty quick. And what I found was I set a keyframe here. Believe it or not, well, you can see it on the screen. I set a keyframe around 120, and there was a keyframe at 81, so there are no keyframes between. But yet it tracked it so well that I felt it was good enough. Okay, now here's a spot, actually right here. Here's a spot where it looks like I'm getting off track here a little bit, and maybe I need to set a new keyframe. So I'm just going to go ahead and insert a location frame. I don't need to do a scale frame there. Okay, let's just tighten that up a little bit. And it looks like because of a shift in the camera motion, there's another little glitch there, but that's pretty close. Okay, so now here's the concept. The concept is, if I now take, if I turn my blender scene, you can see there's a plane back here. Okay, well I've got this background image mapped to this plane. Okay, so when I render, I can see that background image. Okay, I'm gonna hit escape. Back to my camera view. Okay, you can see the perimeter of that plane. Now, think about this. If I take this plane and make it a child of this, then that means that whenever this little polygon either moves or sizes, this plane is going to move or size with it. Okay? So, actually, I confused you there because what I was clicking on was the perimeter of my camera instead of the perimeter of the plane. The plane is actually so large that you can't see it in the camera view. Okay, but bottom line is, if I pull out here, you can see as my tracking marker sizes and moves, that plane moves with it. Okay, translates with it. So, and that's exactly what happens in After Effects when you use its trackers. If you do a 2-point track in After Effects, the only way that After Effects actually matches the background to your subject is by taking the translation of the markers or of the trackers, and it just applies that translation to whatever background layer you want to use. So in essence, we're doing the exact same thing that After Effects does here. Okay? Does this make sense? If this had just been a dot, it would have been very difficult because all I could have done is track the X and the Y positions of the marker. But because it's kind of a large tracker, by using scaling as well, I've been able to reproduce the actual zooming in and zooming out of the camera, because you can see, hopefully here, let's see if you see what's happening as the camera was zooming out. Obviously my background image gets smaller, which makes it appear farther away. And then once the camera started panning, obviously the scaling stopped, because I didn't have to scale the tracking marker, and it just all moves over to the left, and there you go. Well, the question, of course, is how well did it work? Well, let's go back to, I've got another screen here. Blender's kind of bogging down here because it's wanting to render something. But in the same project, I went ahead and created a node setup. Okay. In the node setup, what I have is viewer. This viewer is showing us my render layers. So from my render layers, you can see I rendered everything as a single layer, but I made sure to include a vector layer. Make sure you do that, because you're going to want to use vector blur to match the motion blur of your subject to your background. Okay? I took my render layers, fed them into a hue and saturation node. The reason I did that is just for the obvious reasons that the background image compared to my subject was just too saturated. Okay? So I gotta switch this so it's looking at my viewer node. So we just toned down the saturation a bit, kicked up the lightness a bit. Then I fed that into my vector blur node. So my speed, my Z, and my image is color corrected. But then we go into a vector blur node. Let's have a look at that. Now we have to do, I believe we have to do a render to see that. Yeah, we do. Okay. Actually, I'm going to keep moving here, but there really is no simple way to see the results of a vector blur without doing a full render. And I'm not actually looking at the render output here. I'm looking at the viewer. So long story short is taking the output of a vector blur node into a viewer really doesn't make sense. Okay. In order to match my subject, I also put the output after the blur node, or the vector blur, which is motion blur is what that is. I also put it through a regular blur mode and just did a slight softening to the image. That's just to make it match up to my subject better. Now over here, let's look at what's coming out here. Whoops, sorry. Okay. This needs to be apparently reloaded. Load new. And this is going to be, I believe, this is what we want, because this is going to be our final despilled footage with its alpha channel intact. Okay. So this is our foreground. This is our background. Okay. We blurred the background a little bit. I also did a little bit of color correction to my subject. That actually seems a little strong to me. But trust me, I don't know if this is actually the final version that went to the client. But as you recall, this imagery looked like it was stretched a little tall. So what I did was I put it through a scale node and just increased it 1/10 in the X in order to fatten it back up again so it looked normal. And then, lo and behold, alpha over, I took my Targa with its alpha channel and put it over top of my background image. I know I'm talking like a robot. That's because I'm thinking and talking at the same time. Okay. That looks okay. Let's go ahead and jump up a bit here and do a render. Okay. Is this updating? It is not. I need to tell this that it's supposed to be a sequence. Okay. All right, let's go back to, okay. Let's go to like frame 60 or something. Just take a look. Okay, that's coming out of our viewer node. What I need to do is look at the actual composite so that I can see the results of the vector blur. Okay, so let's view the render result. Render that. So there's my image. Computes the vector blur. You can see it blurred it a little bit. There's my subject. Okay. There's not a ton of motion here, so I'm going to go ahead and jump to frame like 110 and see a little bit more motion. All right. This is where having a quad core does help, no doubt about it, because I've got 8 render threads going here. Okay, so you can see that the vector blur is definitely taking place, and I'm going to go ahead and jump to 130. Now, here's a little technique for you. What I did was I went ahead and rendered this sequence, okay? And I wanted to play it back in real time and see how it worked. So there's a lot of motion blur, and it looks like my subject's already out of the picture, so I'm going to go back 10 frames and render that. And you're probably going to complain here that the matte lines, that there are matte lines that can be seen around the subject, and you're right, there are. The fact of the matter is the camera's moving so fast that in the context of the live video, you're not going to see that. And that's kind of part of the skill of the compositor, really, is knowing what your limitations are. But what I did was I went into a sequence view and went ahead and pre-rendered this. Well, what I did was I threw in the image sequence that I had just rendered out of the compositor, okay? So the cool thing about that is there's my image sequence. Now if I have to go back here and change something or re-render some of the frames, but maybe not all of them, that's okay. When I go back here, you know, if I re-rendered these frames right here, obviously this is still going to show up. So that's just a convenient way to see the results of what you did. But all in all, that doesn't look too bad. I think Blender's loading this up into memory right now, so hopefully it'll play back a little faster. It's a little choppy no matter what, just because of Camtasia is having to record all this stuff. But I mean, as you can see, the track really worked pretty well. Okay, is it perfect? You know what? I don't think it's perfect, and a little bit more fine tuning probably could have made it perfect. But all in all, a really good result. We've got our motion blur that comes from the Blender's vector blur, and so we've solved a number of problems. We have pulled a matte. We've used color work to get rid of the tracking markers. We have gotten rid of the green spill, and we've done a 2D track.